Before we begin, let yourself settle. Let your shoulders soften into whatever is holding you right now, whether it is a pillow, a blanket, or simply the quiet dark behind your eyes. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to solve. Tonight is not for thinking. Tonight is for drifting. Somewhere far from here, out past the last fences and the last rutted wagon roads, there is a town that most maps forgot to keep. It sits low in a bowl of pale desert, ringed by soft hills the color of old parchment, and it goes by a name that sounds like a lullaby all on its own. Forgotten Springs. They say that in this town every clock stopped at the very same moment years and years ago and never moved again. Not the tall clock in the schoolhouse hall, not the small brass one on the preacher's mantle, not even the pocket watches carried close to the heart of every soul who ever called that town home. They say the townspeople do not mind. They say the people there sleep more deeply than anyone else in the territory and wake without hurry and move through their days the way a river moves through a wide, flat valley, unbothered, unrushed, going exactly where it means to go. Tonight we will walk into that town together, just as a young woman named Josephine Clay once did, on an evening when the sky was the color of warm honey and the wind moves slower than any wind has a right to move. We are not here to solve a mystery. We are only here to rest inside one. So close your eyes if you'd like, or simply let them grow heavy, and let your breathing slow to match the pace of a town where no one is ever late. Picture, if you will, the road that leads there. A pale ribbon of packed earth winding between low hills, the color of dried wheat cottonwoods, standing here and there like old friends, who have agreed to wait exactly where you left them. Picture the light of a late afternoon sun, thick and golden, as poured honey settling over rooftops that have long since stopped hurrying toward any particular hour. There is a sound the desert makes in the evening that you may already know, even if you have never stood in one, a low, contented hush wind moving slow through brush and grass, the occasional creak of a windmill turning at its own unbothered pace. Let that sound settle into your ears now. Let it be the only sound you need. Let your breathing slow now to match the pace of a town where no one is ever late. Let us begin. Chapter 1. Arrival in Forgotten Springs. The desert had a way of stretching the hours thin until a single afternoon felt like it might hold an entire lifetime inside it. Josephine Clay had been riding since dawn, her mare's hooves falling into that same unhurried rhythm the whole territory seemed to share. And by the time the sun began its long, slow descent toward the western ridge, she was tired in the pleasant way that comes from travel rather than trouble. She had heard of Forgotten Springs from an old trapper 3 towns back, a man with a voice like gravel settling at the bottom of a creek. He had told her over a shared tin cup of coffee that there was a settlement out past Coyote Ridge where every clock in every house had stopped at the exact same minute decades before and had never ticked again. Nobody fixes them, he'd said, staring into the fire rather than at her. Nobody wants to. Josephine collected stories the way other travelers collected pelts or gold dust. She was a folklorist by trade, though she preferred to think of herself simply as a listener, someone who went from town to town, gathering the soft, strange tales that lived in the spaces between recorded history. A town full of stop clocks was exactly the kind of thing that made her reach for her notebook before she'd even finished her coffee. So she had turned her mare westward, and here she was cresting the last low rise before the land dropped gently down into a wide basin cupped between hills the color of dust and dried wheat. And there it was. Forgotten Springs laced below her like something half-remembered from a dream. A scattering of wooden buildings with faded false fronts. A single dirt street running its modest length. A scatter of cottonwood trees standing sentinel near what she guessed must be the spring the town was named for. Smoke rose from a few chimneys in thin, unhurried threads drifting upward without any apparent urgency, as though even the smoke here had learned to take its time. The sky above the town had turned the color of warm honey streaked through with soft lavender near the horizon, and the light fell across the rooftops in long amber ribbons that made everything look gilded, gentle, and impossibly still. Josephine sat her horse for a long moment at the top of that rise, simply looking. She had ridden into 100 towns before. She knew the particular sounds a living town made from a distance, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the creak of a windmill, the far-off calling of children at play, dogs barking, wagon wheels grinding over hard-packed earth. Towns had a hum to them, a low, busy murmur that carried on the wind even before you arrived. Forgotten Springs had none of that. It wasn't silent exactly. She could hear the wind moving through the cottonwoods and somewhere below the faint trickle of water over stone. But there was no clamor, no urgency. It was as if the whole town were caught mid-breath in that long, easy pause between one heartbeat and the next. She found she did not mind the quiet at all. If anything, something in her chest loosened at the sound of it, or rather at the absence of sound that usually pressed at her from every town she'd known. She nudged her mare forward, and the horse too seemed to slow her pace as they descended, as though some invisible hand had reached down and turned the whole world's clockwork gears just a fraction gentler. The road into town was soft with pale dust packed down by wagon wheels and years of unhurried footsteps. Josephine passed a low fence lined with sun-bleached wood, a garden gone to seed with tall sunflowers, nodding heavy heads in the evening light, and then the first buildings of the town proper, a mercantile with a faded sign, a livery stable with its wide doors thrown open to the golden air, a two-story building that might have once been a hotel. An old man sat on the porch of the mercantile, rocking gently in a chair that seemed to have worn a groove into the boards beneath it through long repetition. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pushed back from his forehead, and he watched her come with mild, unhurried interest, the way one might watch clouds change shape. "Evening," Josephine called, drawing her mare to a stop. "Evening," the old man replied in no particular hurry to say more. "I'm looking for a place to rest for a night or two," she said. "Is there a boarding house in town?" The old man considered this question with the same unhurried care he might have given to considering the weather or the turning of a season. "Widow Hensley takes in travelers," he said at last. "Down past the church, blue door, can't miss it. She'll feed you well and ask you nothing you don't want to answer." "Thank you," Josephine said, and something about the phrase "ask you nothing you don't want to answer" settled into her mind like a small stone dropped into still water, sending out slow, careful ripples. A younger man emerged from the livery stable across the street, wiping his hands on a leather apron, and offered with a nod to take her mare for the night. "Long ride?" he asked, running a gentle hand along the horse's neck. "Longer than I planned," Josephine admitted, swinging down from the saddle. "She'll rest well here," the young man said with the same unhurried certainty she was already coming to expect from everyone she met. "Animals settle into this place quicker than people do sometimes. I've seen horses come through skittish as anything, and by morning they're calm as old plow mules. Something in the water, my father used to say. Something in the air, more like." He led the mare gently toward the stable's wide-open doors, and Josephine watched them go, the horse's steps already looser than they had been on the long ride in. She gathered her travel bag and continued on foot past storefronts with dust-filmed windows, past a well where a young woman drew water with unhurried, graceful movements, past a row of cottonwood trees whose leaves caught the last of the honeyed light and turned it into something like scattered coins. And everywhere she looked, she began to notice something curious. Through the mercantile's front window, she caught sight of a tall case clock standing against the far wall, its brass pendulum frozen mid-swing, its hands pointing to a time that made no sense against the golden evening outside. 3:30, the hand said, though the sun told a very different story. She thought little of it at first. Clocks broke down all the time in every town, and no one thought much of a single-stop clock. But as she rode on, she noticed another. A small clock in the window of what might have been a milliner's shop, its hands also frozen at 3:30, and another glimpsed through the open door of a modest home ticking silently on a mantel, hands unmoving, pointing to the very same impossible hour. 3:30. Every clock she passed told the same frozen story. Josephine felt a small, pleasant shiver move through her, the kind she associated with the beginning of a good story. Not fear, but the particular quiet thrill of standing at the edge of a mystery, sensing its shape before she understood its meaning. She found Widow Hensley's boarding house exactly where the old man had promised, a modest two-story building with a blue door faded nearly to gray by years of desert sun, morning glories climbing the porch rail in slow, unhurried spirals. A pair of rocking chairs sat empty on the porch, angled toward the street, as though positioned long ago for exactly this hour of evening, and a small tin bell hung beside the door, tarnished with age but still bright enough at its edges to catch the last of the sun. Josephine reached up and rang it once gently, and the sound rolled out warm and clear across the quiet street before fading slowly into the evening hush. The widow herself answered Josephine's knock, a woman perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck and eyes the soft brown of well-worn leather. She looked at Josephine for a long moment, taking her in without any rush, the way one might take in a familiar painting rather than a stranger. "You'll be wanting supper and a bed," the widow said. It was not quite a question. "If you have room," Josephine said. "There's always room," Widow Hensley said, and something in the way she said it made Josephine think the words meant more than they seemed to. She was shown to a small, clean room upstairs with a narrow bed made up in soft quilts the color of desert twilight, and a washstand beneath a window that looked out over the town's single street. A clock sat on the small table beside the bed, a modest wooden clock, plain and unremarkable, except that its hands too pointed to 3:30 and did not move. Josephine set down her travel bag and crossed to the window. Outside, the light was fading now, the honey gold of evening giving way to the deeper violet of approaching night. Lanterns were being lit in windows up and down the street, their small, warm glow blooming one by one like flowers opening at dusk. Somewhere below, she heard the soft murmur of voices, unhurried and low, and the distant, patient trickle of the spring that had given the town its name. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let her shoulders drop, feeling the day's travel settle out of her bones the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water. 3:30, the little clock beside her bed insisted, though the darkening sky told her it was closer to 8 in the evening. She did not know yet what had stopped every clock in Forgotten Springs at that single frozen moment. She did not know that she would spend the coming days walking its quiet streets, listening to its unhurried people, and searching for an answer that might never fully arrive. She only knew as she blew out the lantern and let the dark of the room fold gently around her that something in this town had already begun to slow the ticking of her own restless heart. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Josephine Clay closed her eyes and slept without dreaming of anywhere else she needed to be. Sometime in the deepest part of that first night, she woke briefly, the way travelers often do in unfamiliar beds, uncertain for a moment where she was. Moonlight had found its way through the thin curtain and lay in a pale silver bar across the quilt, and she lay still for a while listening. There was almost nothing to hear. A dog barked once far off and fell silent. The wind moved softly through the cottonwoods near the spring, a sound so gentle it seemed more like breathing than weather. Somewhere below, a floorboard settled with a small, patient creak, the house easing itself the way old houses do, unhurried even in their aging. She thought, drifting back towards sleep, that she could not remember the last time silence had felt so complete and so kind. In most towns, even at night, there was some undercurrent of tension in the quiet, the sense that morning would bring its usual demands, that the silence was only a pause before the next day's rushing resumed. Here the silence felt whole in itself, needing nothing to follow it, asking nothing of the dark. She slept again deeply and did not stir until the pale gold of morning had already begun to climb the wall opposite her bed. When she woke fully, she lay for a while, simply watching the light move slow and unhurried across the modest furnishings of her room, the plain washstand, the small wooden clock with its frozen hands, a chair in the corner draped with her traveling cloak. Dust motes turned lazily in the single shaft of sunlight that found its way through the window, and she found herself for a long moment entirely content to do nothing at all but watch them. It occurred to her as she finally rose and began to dress that she had traveled through dozens of towns in her years as a folklorist, and she could recall of nearly every one of them the particular anxious texture of her first morning, the urgency to begin asking questions, to start filling her notebook, to justify the journey with some early harvest of story. She searched for that same urgency, now turning it over the way one searches a pocket for a coin one is certain must be there. She could not find it. In its place was only a quiet, patient curiosity, entirely without edges, entirely without hurry, as though the town itself had reached into her while she slept, and gently loosened something that had been wound too tight for years. She dressed slowly, folding her cloak with more care than the task required simply for the pleasure of taking her time with it, and made her way down toward the smell of coffee, rising warm and rich through the boarding house floor. Chapter 2. Meeting the Townspeople. Morning in Forgotten Springs arrived the way morning arrives in old memories, soft at the edges, gilded rather than bright, unfolding at its own unhurried pace. Josephine woke to the smell of coffee and biscuits drifting up through the boarding house floorboards, and for a moment she lay still beneath the quilts, listening to the quiet sounds of the town waking around her. A rooster crowed somewhere in the middle distance, though even that sounded gentler than roosters she'd known elsewhere, as if the bird itself had learned to take its time. She dressed and made her way downstairs, where Widow Hensley had laid a modest breakfast at a long wooden table. Biscuits still warm from the oven, a dish of butter, a pot of coffee that filled the whole room with its rich, dark smell. "Sleep well?" the widow asked, setting a cup before her. "Better than I have in months," Josephine admitted, and found she meant it entirely. "Forgotten Springs does that," the widow said in the same unhurried tone she seemed to use for everything. "The town has a way of teaching a body to rest." Josephine wrapped her hands around the warm cup, feeling the steam rise against her face. "I noticed your clocks," she said carefully. "All of them. Every one I've seen since I rode in yesterday points to the same hour." Something passed briefly across the widow's face, not alarm, not secrecy exactly, but a kind of soft, private amusement, as though Josephine had asked a question the whole town had long ago stopped finding strange. "3:30, Widow Hensley said. "Yes, they've all read that hour for longer than I care to count." "May I ask why?" Widow Hensley set down her own cup and looked at Josephine for a long moment, the same unhurried appraisal she had offered the evening before. "You may ask a great many things while you're here, Miss Clay, and you'll find most folks glad to answer what they can. I'll tell you plainly, though, since it seems only fair before you spend your days chasing an explanation nobody in this town truly knows why. We've had 100 years near enough to wonder, and wondering has worn the question smooth rather than sharp. I doubt you'll find the answer sitting neatly in any one place waiting to be picked up like a dropped coin." "I understand," Josephine said. "I'm not sure I expect a tidy answer. I think I'm simply curious what it feels like to live inside such a mystery day after day without needing it resolved." Something warmed in the widow's expression at that, a quiet approval that reminded Josephine briefly of her own grandmother's face. "That's a rarer curiosity than you might think," Widow Hensley said. "Most folks who come through wanting the story want it wrapped up neat so they can carry it off whole to tell at their next supper table. You seem willing to carry it a little messier than that." The widow considered the question the way she seemed to consider everything unhurried, turning it over like a smooth stone in her palm. "You may ask," she said. "Whether anyone can answer it properly is another matter. Best you talk to some of the others in town. Old Mr. Abernathy at the Mercantile has been here longest of anyone. And the schoolteacher, Miss Prescott, she keeps the old records, such as they are." It was Josephine would come to understand a very particular kind of answer, the kind that pointed her onward without quite closing any doors, the kind she would receive again and again in the days that followed. After breakfast, she walked the length of the town's single-street notebook tucked beneath her arm, the morning air still cool and carrying the faint mineral scent of the spring. The old man from the Mercantile porch, Mr. Abernathy, she now knew, greeted her with the same unhurried nod he'd offered the evening before, as though a full day had not passed at all, or as though a full day here meant something different than it did elsewhere. "You're the folklorist," he said, not quite a question, settling back into his porch chair. "I collect stories," Josephine said, taking the chair he gestured toward. "I understand Forgotten Springs has an unusual one." Mr. Abernathy's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Every town's got a story," he said. "Ours just happens to be written on the face of every clock we own. Can you tell me what happened? Why they all stopped at 3:30? The old man was quiet for a long moment, rocking gently, his gaze drifting out toward the hills beyond the town, where the morning light was still climbing free of shadow. "I was a young man when it happened," he said finally. "Younger than you are now, I'd wager. It wasn't a single day, if I recall it right, more a season, though the particulars have gone soft in my memory, the way particulars do when a body stops needing them. What I recall clear as anything is how it felt after, like the whole town let out a breath it had been holding since before I was born. But nothing frightening happened, no storm, no accident. Nothing you'd call frightening," Mr. Abernathy said, "unless you count the fright of realizing you'd been rushing your whole life towards something that wasn't there. That frightened some folks plenty for a spell. Others took to it like water finding its level." Josephine wrote quickly in her notebook, though she found that half of what she wanted to capture wasn't the words themselves but the quality of the old man's voice as he spoke them, unhurried, warm, entirely without the anxious edge she might have expected from a man describing something so strange. "And the clockmaker," she said. "Widow Hensley mentioned there was one once. Did he try to fix them?" Something gentle and a little sad passed over Mr. Abernathy's face. "Old Silas Whitlock," he said. "Best clockmaker in the territory once. He tried in the early days, took apart every mechanism in every clock in this town, cleaned the gears, oiled the springs, set them ticking again with his own two hands. He paused. Every one of them stopped again within the hour. Every one of them back to 3:30, like water finding its own low ground. What happened to him? He kept his workshop a long while after that out at the edge of town. Spent his evenings watching the stars instead of the gears, I'm told. Passed on some years back now. Peaceful, mind you. Peaceful as anything in this town ever is. Josephine felt the small, familiar thrill of a story deepening beneath her hands, the sense of a mystery that was not a single locked door, but a long hallway of smaller rooms, each opening onto the next. Would his workshop still be standing? Still standing, Mr. Abernathy confirmed. Nobody's had the heart to tear it down, nor much use for the space either. You'll find it easy enough out past the schoolhouse, where the road starts climbing toward the ridge. She thanked him and rose to continue her walk, and he called after her, unhurried as ever. You won't solve it, you know. Better folks than you have tried. I'm not sure I'm trying to solve it, Josephine said, surprising herself with the honesty of the answer. I think I might just be trying to understand it. Mr. Abernathy smiled at that, a slow, satisfied smile, as though she had passed some quiet test she hadn't known she was taking. Now that he said might just be possible. She continued down the street past the schoolhouse, where she could hear the soft murmur of children reciting lessons in unhurried unison, past a small church with a modest steeple, past the well where she had seen the young woman drawing water the evening before. The young woman was there again, and this time she looked up as Josephine passed, offering a warm, unguarded smile. You're the traveler who arrived last evening, she said. I'm Amelia Voss. I teach at the schoolhouse alongside Miss Prescott. Josephine Clay. They shook hands, and Josephine found herself studying the young woman's face, open, calm entirely, without the wariness she sometimes met in small towns, unused to strangers. I understand you might know something of the town's history, the clocks, I mean. Amelia's expression softened into something like fondness. Everyone in Forgotten Springs knows something of it, she said, though I'm not sure anyone knows all of it. Miss Prescott keeps the old records at the schoolhouse, what few there are. You're welcome to look through them if you'd like, though I should warn you the records raise more questions than they answer. That doesn't surprise me, Josephine said. Nothing in this town seems to answer plainly. Amelia laughed a soft, easy sound. No, she agreed. I suppose it doesn't, but perhaps that's not such a terrible thing. Some questions are better lived with than answered. Amelia set down her bucket a moment, resting her hands against the well's smooth stone rim, and looked out toward the low hills beyond the town, with an expression Josephine could not quite place, something between fondness and wonder, as though she were seeing the familiar view fresh through a stranger's borrowed eyes. May I ask you something odd? Amelia said. Of course. Do you find in your travels that most people are in a hurry even when they've nowhere in particular to be? Josephine considered the question honestly. I think that describes most of the towns I've known, she admitted, and most of my own years, if I'm honest. Amelia nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had long suspected. I met a drummer once passing through who told me the same thing about every city he'd visited. Said folks walk fast down the street even when they had no particular appointment waiting. Said they ate their supper fast even when no one was rushing them off to anywhere else. I've never understood it, but I think I begin to understand you at least a little more each day you're here. You've slowed some since you rode in. Have I? You have, Amelia said, smiling. Your questions yesterday came quick, one after another, like you were racing to catch something before it got away. Today you're asking them slower, like you're not so worried anymore about catching anything at all. Josephine laughed softly at the accuracy of the observation. I hadn't noticed the change in myself. I suppose that's rather the point of this town, isn't it? That the change happens before you notice it happening. That's exactly the point, Amelia agreed, lifting her bucket once more. Come, Miss Prescott will be glad of the company and gladder still of an excuse to set aside her lesson plans a while. They walked together toward the schoolhouse, and Josephine found herself matching her pace to Amelia's slower than her usual stride, unhurried, as though the whole town had taught this young woman to move through the world at exactly the speed the world deserved to be moved through. Inside the schoolhouse was cool and dim sunlight, filtering through tall windows and soft golden bars that fell across rows of simple wooden desks. Miss Prescott, the schoolteacher, was an older woman, with iron gray hair and kind, sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "A folklorist," Miss Prescott said when Amelia had made the introductions. "We don't get many of those out here. Mostly ranchers and drummers and the occasional lost soul looking for gold that isn't there. I understand you keep some of the town's old records." Miss Prescott's expression grew thoughtful, and she set down the small stack of slates she had been carrying, giving Josephine her full and careful attention. "I do," she said, "though I ought to warn you before you get your hopes too settled that record-keeping in a town like ours is a different sort of art than you might be used to. We keep records of births and deaths and land claims well enough. But the deeper history, the history of why our clocks rest the way they do, that's never been the sort of thing that fit neatly onto a ledger page. I'd still like to see whatever you have." "Of course," Miss Prescott said, something warming in her sharp eyes. "I confess I've grown rather fond of visitors who ask that question and mean it. Most folks who pass through want the short version, the tidy version, something they can repeat at their next stop without much trouble. You strike me as someone willing to sit with the longer, messier version instead." "I think I am," Josephine said, and found saying it aloud that it was truer than she might have claimed a week before. "Come, I'll show you what we have. Though I warn you now, as Amelia surely has already, you'll leave with more questions than you arrive with." "I've made my peace with that," Josephine said, and meant it more than she expected to. Miss Prescott led her to a small back room lined with shelves where ledgers and journals sat, gathering the soft dust of years. She pulled down a thick leather-bound volume and set it carefully on a reading table. Before opening it, she paused, running her fingers lightly along its worn spine. "This ledger has outlasted 3 school teachers before me," she said. "I sometimes think it's kept better time than any clock in this town in its own patient way, marking not hours but the slow accumulation of a whole community's memory. The town's founding records," she said, "and what accounts exist of the days the clock stopped. I should tell you plainly, Miss Clay, there is no single explanation written down anywhere in this town. Only impressions. Only what people remember feeling rather than what they remember seeing." Josephine opened the ledger's worn cover, the paper inside soft and browned with age, and began very slowly to read. Before she lost herself entirely to its pages, Miss Prescott lingered a moment longer in the doorway, watching her with the same kind, sharp eyes she had offered upon their first meeting. "You'll find," the schoolteacher said, "that the closer you look at this town's history, the less it resembles a puzzle with a missing piece, and the more it resembles a photograph left too long in the sun, softened at the edges. Some details simply faded past recovering. That doesn't discourage you teaching children about a town whose own history has gone soft at the edges." Miss Prescott considered this with a small, thoughtful smile. "I've come to think there are 2 kinds of history, Miss Clay. There's the kind you can pin down with dates and certainties, the kind fit for a proper ledger. And there's the kind that lives more truly in a feeling, in the way a whole town moves, the way its people greet a stranger, the way its evenings settle into its afternoons. I teach my students both kinds. I find the second kind wears better over a lifetime." She left Josephine to her reading then, and the morning passed in a long, comfortable quiet, broken only by the soft murmur of Amelia's lessons through the thin wall, the occasional creak of the schoolhouse settling in the warming sun, and the patient turning of old pages beneath Josephine's careful hands. She found among the ledger's later entries small domestic details that told her more in some ways than any grand explanation might have. A note recording that the town's single bell, mounted once above the schoolhouse to call children to their lessons, had also stopped ringing true on the very same afternoon the clocks had frozen, though the bell itself remained undamaged and could still be rung by hand whenever the need arose. A note describing how in the weeks following several families had quietly stopped winding their mantel clocks altogether, not from any failure of the mechanisms, but from a shared unspoken sense that winding them further would somehow be a discourtesy to whatever had settled over the town. She found, too, a single line added in a different hand than Everett Doyle's careful script, tucked into the margin of one page as though jotted in a private, unguarded moment. "We have stopped rushing towards supper and found we enjoy it more for arriving unhurried." Josephine smiled at that small human sentence and copied it carefully into her own notebook, sensing that it captured something the ledger's larger entries, for all their careful record-keeping, had somehow failed to hold quite so well. Outside the schoolhouse windows, the sun climbed higher over forgotten springs, gilding the quiet street in warm morning light, and somewhere in the distance the spring that gave the town its name went on trickling patiently over stone, keeping its own time, in its own unhurried way, exactly as it had for as long as anyone could remember. Chapter 3. The silent clocks. The ledger told her little that Mr. Abernathy had not already offered, though it offered something else entirely, the particular comfort of seeing a strange truth confirmed in careful, faded handwriting rather than merely spoken aloud. Josephine spent the better part of the morning bent over its pages, Miss Prescott occasionally drifting past to offer some small clarification, Amelia returning to her lessons in the front room, her voice a soft, patient murmur through the thin schoolhouse wall. The entries were sparse and strange in their sparseness. A town clerk named Everett Doyle had kept the ledger faithfully for years, recording births and deaths and land claims in a neat, careful hand, and then in an entry dated the spring of a year long past, his handwriting seemed to loosen, as though the hand that held the pen had itself grown unhurried. Today the clock stopped, the entry read. All of them at the same moment, though no one can say they heard anything or felt anything save a great and sudden peace, like a held breath finally released. Reverend Coltrane says it is not our place to question a gift. I confess I am inclined to agree with him, though I could not say why. Josephine read the passage 3 times, feeling something settle strangely in her chest. Not disappointment at the lack of explanation, but a curious contentment, as though the absence of explanation was itself a kind of answer. She spent the afternoon walking the town with her notebook cataloging the clocks she found. There was the tall case clock in the Mercantile, its brass pendulum forever suspended mid-swing. There was a delicate porcelain clock in the window of what had once been a milliner's shop, its painted face chipped at one corner, hands frozen at 3:30 beneath a faint film of dust. There was a heavy iron clock mounted above the door of the livery stable, weathered by years of sun and wind, its hands unmoving even as the shadows of the day swept slowly past it. Everywhere she looked, the same silent testimony. 3:30 in wood and brass and porcelain, in iron, in every home and shop and public building she passed. What struck her most, though, was not the clocks themselves, but the townspeople's relationship to them. In any other town, a broken clock would have been mended, replaced, or at the very least resented as a small daily inconvenience. Here the stop clock seemed almost to be honored rather than tolerated. Dusted, carefully kept in places of quiet prominence, treated with something like the reverence one might show an old photograph of a beloved face. She found an elderly woman, Mrs. Odell, sweeping the small porch of a modest house near the edge of town, and paused to ask about the clock. She glimpsed through the open door a handsome walnut case clock, clearly once a treasured possession. "That was my husband's clock," Mrs. Odell said, leaning on her broom. "Brought it all the way from Ohio, he did, before we ever came west. Cost him near a month's wages. He must have treasured it." Mrs. Odell's eyes softened at the memory. "He wound it every night before bed regular as his own breathing for near 30 years. I used to tease him something fierce about it, told him he cared more for that clock's rest than his own some nights, the way he fussed over it before he'd let himself sleep. He'd only laugh and say a clock kept faithfully was a clock that would keep faith with you in return." She paused, her hand resting fondly on the broom handle. "I think of that now when I look at it standing silent in there. It kept faith with him in the end, same as he always said it would. Just not in the way either of us expected." "Doesn't it trouble you that it stopped?" Mrs. Odell considered the question with the same unhurried thoughtfulness Josephine had come to expect from everyone in Forgotten Springs. "Trouble me, no, dear. I think of it differently now. That clock kept my husband's time faithfully for 30 years, tick by tick, hour by hour, never once letting him rest from the counting of his days. Now it keeps a different kind of time, a gentler kind. I find I don't mind it a bit." "What kind of time is that, or the kind that doesn't rush you toward your own dying?" Mrs. Odell said simply and returned to her sweeping as though she had said nothing more remarkable than a comment about the weather. Josephine walked on, turning the woman's words over in her mind, the way she might turn over a smooth stone found on a riverbank, feeling its shape, its weight, the way it caught the light. She passed the well again, where a small group of children had gathered to play some unhurried game involving a length of string and a great deal of patient laughter. She passed the church, its modest steeple casting a long, gentle shadow across the dusty street. She passed the railroad platform at the town's edge, a single wooden platform beside a spur line that no longer seemed to carry any trains. Weeds growing up through the gaps between the boards, a rusted signal lever frozen at some angle that suggested it too had simply stopped one day and never resumed. She lingered a while at the platform drawn by a large station clock mounted on a post at its edge. its face nearly 2 feet across built, she guessed to be read from a good distance by travelers hurrying to catch a departing train. Its hands, like every other clock she had found, pointed to 3:30, though the paint of its face had weathered and cracked in a way the indoor clocks had been spared the elements, having had free access to its exposed hours for however many decades it had stood its silent watch. She wondered, standing before it, how many travelers over the years had glanced up at that frozen dial, expecting to learn how much longer they had before some departure, only to find the same unmoving hour waiting for them that had waited for everyone before. She wondered whether any of them had felt as she was beginning to feel a strange and unexpected relief in that refusal to measure out the remaining minutes of a goodbye. A rusted bell hung silent beside the clock, meant once she supposed to announce an arriving train, and she found herself picturing the platform as it must have been in busier days. The hiss of a locomotive, the calling of a conductor, the small dramas of arrival and departure that every railway station in the territory once hosted. All of that had gone quiet now, folded into the same patient stillness that had claimed the clocks, and yet the platform did not feel abandoned so much as simply retired, the way an old worker retires from a trade well served, content to sit in the sun and watch the world continue on without needing to hurry alongside it any longer. By late afternoon, her notebook was full of small observations, though none of them added up to anything so tidy as an explanation. She had cataloged clocks. She had gathered gentle, circling answers from kind, unhurried people. She had found again and again the same strange peace at the center of the mystery. Not an absence of understanding, but a presence of something else entirely. Something the townspeople seemed to have made their peace with long before she ever arrived to ask her questions. She returned to Widow Hensley's boarding house as the sky began its long golden turn toward evening, and sat for a while on the porch, notebook closed in her lap, simply watching the light change over the rooftops of the town. The wind moved gently through the cottonwoods near the spring, carrying with it the same unhurried patience she had noticed the evening before, and somewhere below she could hear the soft, steady trickle of water finding its way over smooth stone, keeping its own time, the only clock in Forgotten Springs that had never stopped at all. Widow Hensley came to sit beside her, 2 cups of tea balanced carefully in her hands, and passed one to Josephine without a word. "You've been asking your questions all day," the widow said, settling into the chair beside her. "I have. I'm not sure I've found any answers." "Perhaps the answers aren't the sort of thing you find," Widow Hensley said, "so much as the sort of thing you settle into, like an old chair that's worn to the shape of you." Josephine looked out over the quiet street where lanterns were beginning to bloom one by one in darkening windows, and found she understood the widow's words more than she expected to. "I think," she said slowly, "I would like to see the clockmaker's workshop tomorrow, and the church records, if Reverend Coltrane will allow it." "He will," Widow Hensley said. "Everyone in this town is patient with a good question, even when they haven't got a good answer to offer." They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them, the tea warm in their hands, the town settling into its unhurried rest, and Josephine found that for the second night in a row, she felt no urgency at all, only the soft, spreading contentment of a mystery she was in no hurry to solve. Later, when Widow Hensley had gone inside to bank the kitchen fire for the night, Josephine remained a while longer on the porch alone, her shawl drawn close against the gathering cool. The street below had emptied of its last unhurried footsteps, and one by one, the lantern-lit windows dimmed to darkness as the town settled toward sleep. She found herself listening for the small sounds she had already come to associate with Forgotten Springs. The creak of a porch swing somewhere down the street, the soft complaint of a door easing shut, the ever-present, ever-patient trickle of the spring beneath the cottonwoods. She thought of the clocks she had cataloged that day, each one silent, each one honored rather than resented, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, what it might mean to live one's whole life inside a single unmoving hour, and to call that hour a gift rather than a wound. She did not yet have an answer, but she found, sitting alone in the cooling dark with her notebook closed and her tea gone lukewarm in her hands, that the question itself had become a kind of quiet companion, one she was content for now simply to sit beside. When at last she rose to go inside, the stars had come out fully overhead, scattered thick and silver across the whole wide sky, and she paused a moment at the door to look up at them, feeling smaller in the most comfortable way before slipping inside to the warm, waiting dark of her room. Chapter 4. Stories from Travelers. The next morning brought a soft rain, the first Josephine had seen since arriving in the territory. Not a storm, but a gentle, unhurried shower that seemed to fall in its own good time, dampening the dust of the street and drawing up the rich mineral smell of the desert earth. She took her breakfast slowly, watching the rain trace lazy paths down the window glass, and found herself in no hurry at all to begin the day's inquiries. There was something in the rhythm of Forgotten Springs that had begun to seep into her own bones, a patience she did not remember carrying with her when she rode in 2 days before. By mid-morning, the rain had passed, leaving the street glistening and the air scrubbed clean, and Josephine ventured out to find that the town's small inn near the livery stable had travelers passing through, as travelers occasionally did on their way to somewhere else entirely. She found two of them seated on the inn's shaded porch, a cattle drover named Tom Rourke, weathered and quiet, and a peddler named Mrs. Alice Ferris, whose wagon of goods stood parked nearby, her mule cropping contentedly at a patch of grass beside the road. "You'll be the folklorist," Mrs. Ferris said when Josephine introduced herself. "Word travels fast in a slow town." "I'm gathering what stories I can," Josephine said, settling into a porch chair beside them. "I understand you've passed through Forgotten Springs before." "Twice a year, regular as the seasons," Mrs. Ferris said, "selling notions and sundries up and down this stretch of territory for near 15 years now. And I'll tell you something true, Miss Clay. There's no town in this whole territory I sleep better in than this one." "Sleep better how?" Mrs. Ferris considered the question, her hands folding themselves comfortably in her lap. "Deeper," she said. "Sweeter, if that makes any sense to you. Most towns, a body sleeps with one ear listening for trouble, for weather, for the next day's worries creeping in early. Here I sleep the way I slept as a girl before I had a single worry worth the name. Whole nights pass like they were nothing at all, and I wake feeling like I've been given something back that I didn't know I'd lost." Tom Rourke nodded slowly beside her, his hat tipped back from a weathered, sun-browned face. "Same for me," he said in the unhurried drawl of a man who spent his days moving cattle at exactly the pace cattle preferred to be moved. "I've driven herds through every kind of town there is. Loud ones mean ones so quiet they made a man nervous just to breathe in them. This is the only place I've found where the quiet feels like a kindness instead of a warning." "Do either of you know why the clock stopped?" Mrs. Ferris shook her head, unbothered by the question's lack of easy resolution. "I asked my first time through, more years ago than I care to count. Old Silas Whitlock was still alive then, still tending his workshop out past the schoolhouse. I asked him plain, same as you're asking me now." "What did he say?" "He told me something I've never forgotten," Mrs. Ferris said, her eyes drifting toward the middle distance, toward memory. "He said, 'Ma'am, I've spent 40 years of my life taking apart clocks and putting them back together, and I never once understood a single one of them so well as I understood them the day they all decided to rest.' Then he laughed soft-like and went back to whatever he was doing. I never did get more of an answer than that." Josephine wrote the words carefully in her notebook, feeling the particular weight of them settle into her chest. "There's something else, too," Tom Rourke offered after a thoughtful pause. "Something I've noticed driving through here as often as I have. Time moves different in this town. I don't mean that queer exactly. I mean an afternoon here feels longer than an afternoon anywhere else. Fuller somehow. Like there's more room in every hour than there ought to be." "More room," Josephine repeated. "That's the only way I know to say it," Tom said. "Out on the trail, the days run together till you can't hardly tell one from the next. Here every hour seems to stretch out nice and easy, like a cat finding a warm patch of sun. I couldn't tell you why. I only know it's true every time I pass through." He shifted in his chair, considering further. "I've driven cattle through blizzards and stampedes. Both Miss Clay and I've learned there's a particular kind of tired that comes from a body always bracing for the next trouble. I carry less of that tired through this town than anywhere else on my road. 2 days here rests me the way a full week does most places else. My trail boss thinks I'm soft for saying so, but I've stopped caring what he thinks of it. A man ought to know where he sleeps best and say so plain." Josephine spent the rest of the morning in quiet conversation with the two travelers, gathering small fragments of memory and impression, the way a person gathers shells along a long, patient shoreline, not searching for any single perfect specimen, but content simply to hold each one for a moment before setting it gently into her collection. She learned that travelers who passed through Forgotten Springs often found themselves lingering longer than they intended, a day stretching into 2, two stretching into a week, with no clear reason beyond a certain reluctance to leave. She learned that more than one traveler had described vivid, peaceful dreams during their stay. Dreams of childhood homes, of long-departed loved ones, of moments they had thought entirely forgotten, returned to them whole and warm and startlingly clear. "I dreamed of my mother's kitchen," Mrs. Ferris confided toward the end of their conversation, her voice softening in a way it had not softened before. "First time in over 20 years I've dreamed of her at all. I woke up with tears on my face, but they weren't sad tears, Miss Clay. They were the good kind, the kind that come from remembering something precious you'd let yourself forget." "Can you describe it?" Mrs. Ferris's eyes grew distant, gentle. "It was nothing grand," she said. "Just her kitchen table back in Pennsylvania, and the smell of bread rising near the stove, and her hands floured to the wrist, showing me how to fold dough the way her own mother had shown her. I hadn't thought of that kitchen in decades, Miss Clay. Hadn't let myself, I suppose, since there was grief tangled up in the memory too once. But in the dream there was only the bread and her hands and the particular gold of afternoon light through her kitchen window. I woke feeling like I'd been given a gift I didn't know I was owed." Tom Rourke nodded slowly at this. "I've had my own version," he admitted, quieter now than before. "Dreamed of my brother, the one we lost young. Haven't dreamed of him clear in years, and here I dreamed of us fishing together, plain as if it happened yesterday. Woke up smiling, which isn't a thing I do most mornings." Josephine found herself moved by the quiet trust in both their voices, the ease with which two travelers who had known her only a matter of hours had opened some private, tender chamber of memory. "Do you think it's the town that brings the dreams?" she asked again gently. "I couldn't tell you the mechanism of it," Mrs. Ferris said. "I only know that most nights of my traveling life I dream of worry-lost goods, bad roads, customers gone sour. Here my mind seems to reach instead for whatever was gentlest in my life and holds it up for me to look at a while. I've come to think that might be the truest kindness this town offers. Not rest for the body alone, but rest enough that the mind finally has room to remember what it loves." "Do you think the town causes the dreams?" "I couldn't say what causes what," Mrs. Ferris said. "I only know I come back here twice a year, same as the seasons, and I always leave feeling like I've been given something I didn't know I was missing." Before she left the inn's shaded porch, the innkeeper himself, a broad, quiet man named Jonas Pratt, came out to refill their cups and lingered a moment to add his own gentle observation to the conversation. "I've kept this inn near 20 years now," he said, setting down the coffee pot with unhurried care. "And I'll tell you something curious, Miss Clay, that these two might not have thought to mention. Travelers who stop here for a single night nearly always find some reason to stay a second. It isn't the beds, though they're comfortable enough. It isn't the food, though my wife sets a fine table. It's something else. Something I've never had proper words for. Do you have a guess?" Jonas considered the question, wiping his broad hands slowly on his apron. "I think," he said, "it's the particular relief of arriving somewhere that doesn't ask you to become someone new the moment you step through the door. Most inns a traveler puts on a bit of a performance, minds their manners extra careful, hurries through their supper so as not to trouble the house. Here folks seem to shed all that the moment they cross the threshold. I've watched grown men cry quietly into their soup-missing mothers, 20 years gone, and none of the other travelers so much as glance up from their own plates. It's permission, I suppose, is the closest word I've found for it. Permission to simply be tired or sad or slow without anyone rushing you past it." Mrs. Ferris nodded slowly at this, her hands still folded in her lap. "That's it exactly," she said. "Permission. I hadn't thought to call it that, but you've named it true, Jonas." Josephine wrote the word carefully into her notebook, underlining it, once feeling that it captured something essential about the whole town that she had been circling without quite landing on directly. By early afternoon, the sun had climbed high and warm over Forgotten Springs, drying the last of the morning's rain from the street, and Josephine took her leave of the two travelers with a full notebook and a fuller heart, walking slowly back toward the center of town. She found herself pausing at the well, watching the same young woman she'd seen twice before drawing water in slow, unhurried movements, the rope creaking gently against the wooden pulley, the bucket rising drop by patient drop. There was no urgency in it. There was no urgency in anything here, and Josephine found with some surprise that she had stopped missing the urgency entirely. She thought of her own life before Forgotten Springs, the long days of travel, The endless gathering of stories, the restless feeling that had always driven her onward before she had properly finished sitting still with any single place. She wondered, walking slowly back toward the boarding house in the warm afternoon light, whether that restlessness might simply be a kind of forgetting, a forgetting of how to let an hour be as long and as full as it wanted to be. She did not have an answer, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found she did not need one right away. She spent the last of the afternoon simply sitting beneath the cottonwoods near the spring, listening to Mrs. Ferris's mule crop patiently at the grass nearby, watching the light shift slowly through the leaves above her. Two more travelers passed through. Before evening, a young couple bound for a homestead claimed further west, their wagon loaded with modest belongings, their faces sunbrowned and hopeful. They stopped only long enough to water their horses and take a meal at the inn, but even in that short visit, Josephine noticed the same softening she had heard described by Mrs. Ferris and Tom Rourke. The young husband's shoulders easing down from around his ears, the young wife's tired eyes brightening as she watched her small daughter chase a moth in slow, delighted circles near the well. "We ought to stay the night," the young wife said to her husband loud enough for Josephine to overhear from her spot beneath the trees. "Just the one night. There's something in this air I don't want to leave so soon." They did stay in the end, taking a room at the inn, though they had planned to press on before dark, and Josephine found herself smiling at the small, unplanned surrender of it. One more traveler folding gently into the town's unhurried rhythm, exactly as she herself had done 3 days before. She thought, watching the little girl chase her moth beneath the lengthening shadows of the cottonwoods, that perhaps this was the truest evidence of whatever gift the town held. Not the stop clocks themselves, remarkable as they were, but the way even strangers passing briefly through found their own inner clockwork loosening, slowing, matching itself, however briefly, to the patient rhythm of forgotten springs. Chapter 5. The Abandoned Clockmaker's Workshop. The road to Silas Whitlock's old workshop climbed gently away from the schoolhouse, following the curve of the land up toward the low ridge that marked the town's northern edge, where the desert began to reclaim what civilization had briefly borrowed from it. Josephine walked the path in the soft gold of late afternoon, the light slanting long and low across the pale earth, catching in the silver-green leaves of scattered sagebrush, and turning the whole hillside the color of a memory half recalled. The workshop, when she found it, was a modest wooden building, weathered gray by decades of sun and wind, its single window clouded with dust, its door hanging slightly open on a hinge gone soft with rust. A sign above the door, its painted letters faded nearly to nothing, still bore the ghost of lettering, S. Whitlock Clocks in Fine Repairs. She pushed the door open slowly, and it gave with a low, patient creak as though it too had learned the town's unhurried rhythm. Inside the workshop was dim and still, motes of golden dust drifting lazily through the single shaft of afternoon light that fell through the clouded window. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces still scattered with the small tools of a clockmaker's trade. Tiny screwdrivers, delicate pliers, brass gears of every size laid out in careful rows that time had not disturbed, only softened beneath a fine gray blanket of dust. A magnifying loupe sat exactly where its owner must have set it down for the final time, beside a half-disassembled mechanism whose tiny springs had been laid out with obvious care, numbered on small scraps of paper, as though Silas had intended to return to the work the very next morning. A row of pocket watches hung from pegs along one wall, their chains gathering soft cobwebs, their faces all reading the same familiar patient hour. Along the back wall, shelves held spare parts sorted with a precision that spoke of decades of careful habit. Mainsprings coiled neatly in small tins, escapements arranged by size, tiny brass screws sorted into compartments no larger than a thimble. Josephine ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the nearest workbench, feeling the fine grit of settled dust beneath her fingertips, and found herself picturing the man who must have spent countless unhurried hours in exactly this spot, bent low over some delicate mechanism, coaxing tiny gears back into cooperation with patient, practiced hands. There was a tenderness in the orderliness of the room that told her more about Silas Whitlock's character than any journal entry yet could. A man who respected his tools, who trusted that care given slowly would always outlast care given in haste. And everywhere clocks. Dozens of them lining every shelf and surface in every stage of assembly and disassembly, their cases ranging from plain pine to polished mahogany, their faces painted with Roman numerals or simple dots, their hands, every single one of them, frozen at 3:30. Josephine moved slowly through the space, careful not to disturb the dust that had settled like a soft shroud over everything, feeling the particular hush of a room that had been left exactly as its owner had left it, waiting patient for a return that would never come. She found on a shelf near the back of the workshop a small collection of leather-bound journals, their covers worn soft with handling, and she lifted the topmost one with careful hands, feeling the fragile weight of it. The journal fell open to a page near its middle, and Josephine found herself looking down at Silas Whitlock's own careful handwriting. The ink faded to a soft brown, the words unhurried and thoughtful, as though he had written them the way he must have lived his final years, without any rush at all. "I have spent my whole life believing that time was something to be captured," she read. "Something to be measured out in gears and springs, held accountable to the precise turning of a mainspring, made to march forward in exact and unforgiving increments. I built my trade on this belief. I built my pride on it too, if I am honest with myself in these private pages." She turned the page carefully. "But I begin to wonder now whether I had it backward all along. Whether time was never meant to be captured at all, but only witnessed the way a man witnesses a sunset, without ever once believing he could hold it in his hands. Perhaps that is what happened here in this town all those years ago. Perhaps time simply grew tired of being chased and decided quite gently to sit down and rest." Josephine read the passage twice, feeling something in her chest loosen, the way a tightly wound spring loosens when its tension is finally gently released. She continued reading, moving slowly through the journal's pages, finding entry after entry that circled the same quiet mystery, without ever quite landing on a single tidy answer. In one entry written some 5 years after the clocks had first stopped, Silas described a conversation with a visiting horologist from back east, a man who had traveled a great distance specifically to examine the phenomenon for himself. He was a clever man, and a proud one, Silas had written, and he spent 3 full days with his instruments and his theories testing my clocks for magnetism, for some flaw in the local iron ore, for any manner of scientific explanation his training had equipped him to seek. He left on the 4th day, no wiser than he'd arrived, though considerably more humbled. I confess I did not mind watching his certainty soften. I had once carried that same certainty myself, and I found I did not miss it nearly so much as I once feared I would. Silas Whitlock had clearly spent years turning the question over in his mind, the way a jeweler turns a stone to catch the light from every angle, never quite satisfied that he had found the truest facet, yet never troubled by the search itself. One entry dated some years after the clocks had first stopped caught her attention particularly. "I took apart every clock in this town once more today," Silas had written. "Cleaned every gear, oiled every spring wound, every mainspring as tight and true as my hands know how to make them. And within the hour, every single one had stopped again, hands falling back to that same familiar rest. I confess I no longer try to understand why. I have begun instead simply to admire it. There is something in a mechanism that refuses to be rushed that I find I respect more than I ever respected my own trade's insistence on precision." Josephine set the journal down gently and moved toward the workshop's back window, which looked out over the darkening hills beyond the town, the sky beginning its long transition from gold to violet as evening approached. She thought of her own restless years of travel, her own insistence on gathering story after story, town after town, never quite pausing long enough to let any single place settle fully into her bones. She wondered whether she too had spent her life chasing something that might have been better simply witnessed. She gathered several of the journals carefully, intending to read more that evening by lamplight, and made her way back through the workshop's dim, dust-softened rooms toward the door. At the threshold, she paused, looking back at the dozens of silent clocks lining every shelf, their hands all frozen at the same patient hour, and felt for a long moment that she understood something important about this town that she could not yet put into words. She stepped out into the cooling evening air, and the door creaked shut behind her with the same unhurried patience as every other sound in Forgotten Springs, and she walked back down the gentle slope toward town, with the journals tucked carefully beneath her arm, the sky above her deepening slowly into the soft, star-flecked dark of another peaceful desert night. She paused halfway down the slope where the path leveled briefly before continuing its gentle descent, and looked back once more at the workshop's weathered silhouette against the darkening sky. It struck her, standing there in the cooling evening air, that Silas Whitlock had spent the better part of his working life pursuing an exactness that the town itself had quietly, patiently refused to honor. He had oiled and cleaned and wound again and again, insisting that precision was simply a matter of skilled enough hands, careful enough attention, and again, the town had answered him with the same gentle, immovable rest. She wondered what it must have cost him in those early years to watch his life's trade so thoroughly unmade by something he could neither see nor argue with. And she wondered, too, what particular grace had allowed him eventually to lay down that struggle and take up watching the stars instead. She thought of her own trade, the careful cataloging of stories she had practiced now for the better part of a decade, and wondered whether she too had been quietly insisting on some exactness. The world was never quite willing to grant her the tidy resolution, the satisfying final chapter, the mystery solved and shelved and carried onward to the next eager audience. Perhaps she thought walking on down the darkening slope there was a version of her own craft that might learn from Silas Whitlock's long patient surrender. A version that gathered stories not to solve them, but simply to hold them gently the way one holds a smooth stone or a pressed flower valuable precisely because it could never be fully explained. By the time she reached the bottom of the path, the first stars had begun to prick through the deepening blue overhead, and the lanterns of Forgotten Springs had begun their own slow, warm blooming in window after window, welcoming her back down into the gentle hush of the settling town. Chapter 6. The Old Church and Forgotten Journals. The following morning, Josephine made her way to the small church at the edge of Forgotten Springs, its modest steeple casting a long shadow across the dusty street in the slanting early light. As she approached, she noticed a small boy standing beneath the church's modest bell tower, tugging patiently on a frayed rope, coaxing a single warm, resonant note from the bell above. He did not ring it urgently or repeatedly, the way a boy might ring a bell for the mischief of noise. He rang it once, listened to the note roll out across the quiet street and fade slowly into silence, and seemed entirely satisfied with that single sound. "That's my grandson," Reverend Coltrane said, appearing in the church doorway as Josephine reached the steps, watching the boy with open fondness. "He rings it most mornings just the once. Says he likes to hear how long the sound takes to disappear. I've never had the heart to tell him there's no particular reason to ring it at all, since the bell doesn't call anyone to anything the way it once did. I think he understands in his own boyish way that the ringing is its own small purpose." He greeted her then with the warm, unhurried manner she had come to expect from everyone in town, his handshake gentle and his smile patient. "Widow Hensley told me you might come calling," he said, ushering her into the cool dimness of the small sanctuary. "You'll be wanting to know about the clocks, same as everyone who passes through with a curious mind. I would if you're willing to share what you know." "I'll share what little there is," the Reverend said, leading her to a small side room where church records were kept in careful dust-softened stacks. "Though I should tell you plainly, Miss Clay, that faith and explanation don't always walk the same road. Some things a man simply accepts without needing to understand them fully first." He pulled down a worn ledger, its leather cover cracked with age, and set it gently on a reading table before them. "My predecessor kept these records," he said. "Reverend Amos Coltrane, my grandfather, as it happens. He was reverend here when the clock stopped, and he wrote what he witnessed, such as it was." Josephine opened the ledger carefully, the pages inside soft and browned, and found herself reading the careful hand of a man 3 generations removed from her own time. "I cannot say what caused the clocks of Forgotten Springs to stop," the elder Reverend Coltrane had written. "I can only say what I witnessed, and what I witnessed was this: a great and gentle stillness settling over the town, beginning as best I can reckon it, sometime in the late afternoon. And by evening, every clock I knew of had ceased its ticking, each one stopped at the very same hour. I went from house to house in the days that followed, expecting to find fear or panic or some desperate scramble to understand what had befallen us. Instead, I found something I had not expected at all. I found peace. I found families sleeping more soundly than I had ever known them to sleep. I found old grudges softening, old worries loosening their grip, old griefs settling into something more bearable than they had been before. I do not know if what happened here was a miracle in the sense the good book means the word, but I have come to believe it was a gift however it arrived, and I have counseled my congregation ever since not to question a gift too closely, lest the questioning itself become a kind of ingratitude." Josephine looked up from the page. "Your grandfather believed it was a gift." "He did," Reverend Coltrane said, "and I confess I've come to believe much the same in my own time here. I've buried a great many souls from this town over the years. Miss Clay and I can tell you truly, I have never once presided over a death here that seemed touched by fear. Every soul I've laid to rest in Forgotten Springs has gone peacefully the way a person goes to sleep at the end of a long, satisfying day. That's remarkable. It is, the Reverend agreed, though I confess I've stopped finding it remarkable the longer I've lived here. It simply is what it is. The town rests. Its people rest along with it. I've come to think that might be blessing enough without needing further explanation. Josephine spent the remainder of the morning reading through the old ledgers, finding entry after entry that echoed the same gentle acceptance. Townspeople who had, in the years following the clock's stopping, simply folded the mystery into the fabric of their ordinary lives, the way a river folds a fallen leaf into its current without ever breaking its steady flow. She found records of marriages that had taken place in the sanctuary's cool dimness, of children christened beneath the same stop clock that hung above the pulpit, its hands frozen at 3:30, through generations of births and unions and gentle, unhurried funerals. She found no record anywhere of panic or fear or urgent efforts to reverse whatever had happened, only a long, patient chronicle of a town that had made its peace with something larger than itself. She found tucked between two later ledgers a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon written by townsfolk to family members back east. Several of them never sent, kept instead among the church's records for reasons the letters themselves did not explain. One written in a careful looping hand caught her attention particularly. Dear sister, it began, I know you will think me strange for saying so, but I find I no longer miss the busy streets of home nearly so much as I once feared I would. There is a peace here I cannot properly describe to you, save to say that I sleep the whole night through now, every night for the first time since we were girls together sharing our narrow bed. I do not know what stopped our clocks, and I have stopped asking. I only know that I have never felt more myself than I do here in this small, quiet, patient town. Josephine read the letter twice, feeling the particular ache of a sentiment written for a sister who she suspected had never received it, the words instead settling quietly into a church archive to be found generations later by a stranger passing through. Near midday, Reverend Coltrane brought her a simple lunch of bread and cheese, and they sat together in the sanctuary's quiet, dust-moted light, the old stop clock above the pulpit watching over them both with its frozen, patient face. May I ask you something, Reverend? Of course. Do you ever wish you understood it? Truly understood it. I mean, not simply accepted it. The Reverend considered the question with the same unhurried care he seemed to bring to everything. I used to wish that, he admitted. When I was younger, newer to this pulpit, I wanted very badly to understand the mystery my grandfather had only accepted. I searched these very records for years, hoping to find some explanation he might have missed. And did you find one? No, he said. But somewhere along the way, I stopped needing to. I think perhaps that's the real gift of this town, Miss Clay. Not the mystery itself, but the peace of learning to live alongside a question you'll never fully answer. There's a kind of freedom in that once you stop fighting it. Josephine thought of Silas Whitlock's journal entries of his own long journey from insisting on precision to simply admiring what refused to be rushed, and felt something settle quietly into place within her own chest. I think I begin to understand what you mean, she said. I suspect you do, the Reverend said, smiling gently. This town has a way of teaching that lesson to anyone patient enough to stay and learn it. He walked her to the church door as their conversation drew to its natural close, pausing a moment with his hand on the frame. I'll tell you one thing more, Miss Clay, since you've been generous enough to sit with an old preacher's ramblings all morning. My grandfather used to say that faith and rest were closer cousins than most folks realized. A person who cannot rest, he'd say, has usually stopped trusting that the world will hold together without their constant watching over it. I think this town, whatever caused its clocks to stop, taught its people that particular trust earlier and more thoroughly than most places ever do. That's a generous way to think of it. It's the only way I've found that satisfies me, the Reverend said. And I've looked same as you're looking now. She thanked him for his time and stepped back out into the warm afternoon light, the church's small steeple casting its long shadow behind her, and made her way slowly back through the quiet streets of Forgotten Springs. Her notebook fuller than it had been that morning, though her sense of the mystery itself remained exactly as soft and unresolved as ever. She found walking beneath a wide desert sky with the sun warm on her shoulders that she did not mind the lack of resolution nearly as much as she once might have. There was something almost restful in it, a mystery that asked nothing of her except her patient attention and gave back in return an unexpected and gentle peace. She stopped on her way back toward the boarding house at the small graveyard that lay just beyond the church, enclosed by a low-weathered fence and shaded by a scattering of hardy junipers that had learned, like everything else in Forgotten Springs, to grow slowly and without complaint. The headstones here were modest, most of them simple wood or plain fieldstone, their carved names softened by decades of patient desert weather. She walked among them, slowly reading what she could of names and dates, and found near the graveyard's far corner a stone marked simply, Silas Whitlock. Beneath it, a single carved line, he kept good time in his own way. She stood before the modest marker for a long while, feeling an unexpected tenderness rise in her chest for a man she had never met, known to her only through the careful, thoughtful hand of his private journals. She thought of him watching the stars from his small observatory on the ridge above, unhurried, at peace with a question he had spent a lifetime learning not to need answered, and found herself grateful in some quiet way she could not fully name that his resting place looked out toward that very same ridge. The afternoon light slanted long and gold across the small graveyard as she made her way back toward the gate, and she found herself thinking that perhaps this too was part of the town's particular gift, not merely a peaceful way of living, but a peaceful way of coming, eventually, to rest. Chapter 7. Long walks beneath endless sunsets. The days in Forgotten Springs had begun to blur together in the gentlest way, one golden afternoon folding into the next without any hard edges between them. And Josephine found she had stopped counting how long she had been in town at all. It was Amelia Voss who suggested the walk, finding Josephine on the boarding house porch as the schoolhouse day drew to its unhurried close. "There's a path along the ridge," Amelia said, "that catches the sunset better than any spot in town. I walk it most evenings when the weather allows. You're welcome to join me if you'd like company." Josephine welcomed the invitation gladly, and the two women set out together as the afternoon began its long, slow surrender to evening, following a soft dirt path that climbed gently away from the town's edge, past the schoolhouse, past Silas Whitlock's old workshop, up toward the low ridge that overlooked the whole basin below. "You've lived here your whole life?" Josephine asked as they walked. "My whole life," Amelia confirmed. "My mother came here as a young bride before I was born and stayed on after my father passed. I've never known anywhere else, though. I confess I sometimes wonder what it might be like." "Do you ever wish to leave?" Amelia considered the question with the same soft, unhurried thoughtfulness Josephine had come to recognize as the particular rhythm of Forgotten Springs itself. "Sometimes," she admitted. "When I was younger, I used to dream of the cities I'd read about in books, the noise of them, the crowds, the endless bustle. It seemed exciting in the way distant things always seem exciting to a girl who hasn't yet lived them. And now I think I understand something my mother tried to tell me when I was still young enough to argue with her about it. She used to say that a loud life and a full life aren't always the same thing. I didn't believe her then. I think I'm beginning to now." They crested the ridge as the sun began its final descent toward the western horizon, and the whole sky opened before them in a slow spreading wash of color, gold deepening to amber, amber softening into rose, fading gently into the first deep purples of coming night. Along the ridge's edge, clusters of desert marigold nodded their small golden heads in the evening breeze, and a lone hawk circled lazily overhead, riding some warm current of rising air with barely a movement of its outstretched wings, as though it too had learned the particular patience of this stretch of country. Far below, Josephine could just make out the pale ribbon of the spring winding its way past the cottonwoods, catching the last light in scattered silver flashes. Below them, the town of Forgotten Springs lay cupped in its basin like something cradled gently in two open hands, lanterns beginning to bloom one by one in darkening windows, smoke rising in thin, unhurried threads from a dozen chimneys, the whole scene so peaceful that Josephine felt her breath catch softly in her chest. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It is," Amelia agreed. "I've watched 1,000 sunsets from this ridge, and I don't think I've grown tired of a single one. There's always something new in them if you look closely enough. A different color at the edge of a cloud, a different shape to the shadows below." They sat together on a flat outcropping of pale stone, still faintly warm from the day's sun, and watched the color deepen and spread across the whole wide sky, neither woman feeling any particular need to fill the silence with words. After a long while, Amelia spoke again, her voice soft and thoughtful. "Do you know what I love most about evenings here? Tell me." The way nothing feels wasted, Amelia said. In the stories I've read of cities' evenings seems to be something people rush through. Rush home from work, rush through supper, rush toward whatever comes next. Here evening is its own whole thing. A person can simply sit and watch a sunset finish its work without feeling as though they ought to be doing something else instead. Josephine thought of her own restless years of travel, the way she had always been gathering the next story before she'd properly finished sitting with the last one, and felt the familiar ache of recognition settle into her chest. I think I understand that better than I would have a week ago, she said. This town has a way of teaching that lesson, Amelia said, echoing, without knowing it, the very words Reverend Coltrane had offered Josephine that same morning. I think perhaps that's the truest gift of the stop clocks, not that time itself paused exactly, but that we stopped feeling as though we needed to chase it. They watched the last of the sunset's color fade slowly into the deep violet blue of full evening, the first stars beginning to prick through the darkening sky like scattered grains of silver dust. And Josephine felt something in her own chest loosen, the way Silas Whitlock's journals had described a tension she had carried so long. She had forgotten it was tension at all, easing gently into something softer. They walked back down toward town as full darkness settled over the basin, the path lit only by starlight and the faint golden glow of lantern-lit windows below. And Josephine found she did not mind the dark at all. It felt, if anything, like another kind of gentleness, the world simply easing itself toward rest, the way it had every evening, for as long as anyone in Forgotten Springs could remember. Over the following days, the evening walks became a quiet ritual between them. Sometimes Miss Prescott joined, sharing stories of the town's earlier years. Sometimes old Mr. Abernathy climbed the ridge slowly behind them, settling onto the flat stone with a contented sigh, adding his own weathered observations to the conversation. One such evening, he arrived a little later than the others, breathing heavily from the gentle climb, and lowered himself down with a groan that seemed more satisfaction than complaint. "My knees remember every one of my years," he said, settling his hat beside him, "even if the rest of me sometimes forgets to count them." "You climb up here often?" Josephine asked. "Most fine evenings when my knees allow it," Mr. Abernathy said. "Been climbing this same ridge since I was younger than Amelia here. Watched more sunsets from this exact rock than I could ever hope to count, and I'll tell you something true. Miss Clay, I've never once regretted the climb, though I've regretted plenty else in my long life." "What sorts of things?" The old man considered the question, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the far hills. "Oh, the usual foolishness a young man carries," he said. "Wanting to be somewhere grander than this. Wanting my life to move faster than it was moving back before this town taught me different. I spent my 20s itching to leave, convinced there was some louder, more important life waiting for me elsewhere." "What kept you?" "My father took ill the year I'd finally saved enough to go," Mr. Abernathy said. "I stayed to tend the store in his place, meaning only to stay a season. That season became a year, and the year became the rest of my life. And somewhere along the way, without my noticing exactly when I stopped counting the staying as a sacrifice and started counting it as a gift." Amelia reached over and squeezed the old man's weathered hand gently, a gesture of such simple affection that Josephine felt her own chest tighten with unexpected warmth. "I don't tell that story for pity," Mr. Abernathy added, patting Amelia's hand. "I tell it because I think this town has a way of turning a body's disappointments into something softer given enough patient years. I couldn't have told you that as a young man. I can tell it to you plain as anything now." They sat together as the sun continued its slow, generous descent, and Josephine found herself thinking that this too was a kind of story worth gathering. Not one that resolved into any tidy lesson, but one that simply sat patient and true in the gathering evening light. Sometimes Josephine walked a lone notebook left behind at the boarding house, content simply to watch the sky change color without feeling any need to capture the moment in words. She began to notice during these unhurried evenings a curious quality to her own thoughts. Memories she had not visited in years began surfacing gently unbidden. The particular smell of her grandmother's kitchen, the sound of her father's voice reading aloud by lamplight, small warm fragments of a childhood she had without quite realizing it allowed herself to forget in the long, restless years of her adult travels. "Does that happen to everyone?" she asked Amelia one evening, describing the sudden vivid clarity of a memory that had surfaced unbidden the night before. "The old memories, I mean, coming back so clearly." I think it does, Amelia said. I've heard others describe the same thing. Miss Prescott says it's the town's gift, same as the good sleep in the gentle rhythm of the days. She says a mind that isn't rushing toward the next hour has more room to remember the hours that came before. Josephine thought of this often in the days that followed, walking the quiet streets of Forgotten Springs, in the long gold light of late afternoon, feeling her own restless heart slow gradually to match the town's unhurried pace. She had come to Forgotten Springs seeking a story to collect a mystery to catalog and carry onward to the next town, the next audience, the next chapter in her long career of gathering other people's tales. She found instead that the town had begun slowly and without any fanfare to offer her something else entirely. Not an answer, but an invitation, gentle and unhurried, to simply rest inside a question, rather than rushing past it toward some tidier resolution. And each evening, as the sunset spread its long, slow wash of color across the wide desert sky, she found herself a little more willing to accept that invitation. One such evening, as she and Amelia settled onto their familiar outcropping of stone, Miss Prescott joined them, a little breathless from the climb, and lowered herself carefully onto a neighboring rock with a contented sigh. I don't climb up here as often as I once did, the schoolteacher admitted, but some evenings, the sky calls loudly enough that a body can't refuse it. They watched together as the sun dipped toward the western hills, the light deepening through its familiar procession of gold and amber and rose, and Miss Prescott, unprompted, began to speak of her own early years in Forgotten Springs, of arriving as a young teacher fresh from the East, full of the same urgent restlessness Josephine recognized so well in herself. I thought this town would bore me terribly, Miss Prescott confessed, smiling faintly at the memory. I thought a place with nothing but stop clocks and quiet evenings would have nothing to teach a woman with ambitions. I was wrong, of course, though it took me the better part of 2 years to admit it. What changed your mind? A student, actually, Miss Prescott said. A boy named Caleb, slow with his letters, quick with everything else. I spent a whole autumn trying to hurry him toward reading the way I'd hurried myself through my own education, and I only succeeded in making him miserable. It was Widow Hensley, of all people, who told me to stop rushing the boy, to let him find the letters at whatever pace his own mind wanted to move. I didn't believe her at first, but I tried it out of desperation more than faith, and by spring that boy was reading better than any child I'd taught before or since. It was the first time this town taught me that slow isn't the same as behind. Josephine thought of Silas Whitlock's gears, oiled and wound and set free to find their own unhurried rest, and felt the parallel settle warmly into her chest. They sat together as the last color drained slowly from the sky. Three women of different ages and different histories bound together for this one quiet evening by the same wide, patient view, and Josephine found she wanted quite badly to remember this particular moment for a very long time. Chapter 8, The Observatory and the Final Writings. It was Miss Prescott who first mentioned the observatory some days into Josephine's stay over a quiet cup of tea in the schoolhouse's small back room. Silas Whitlock built more than clocks, the schoolteacher said. Out past his workshop, up where the ridge flattens before it climbs toward the higher hills, he built himself a small observatory. Spent his last years there more than in the workshop itself, I'm told, watching the stars instead of the gears. Is it still standing? Still standing, Miss Prescott confirmed, though nature's been slowly reclaiming it, same as it reclaims most things left long enough to its patient attention. You'll find his final journals there if the weather's left them readable. He kept a second set of writings in that place separate from the ones you found in his workshop. Josephine set out this following afternoon, following the same path she had walked with Amelia past the schoolhouse, past Silas Whitlock's weathered workshop, but continuing onward this time along a fainter trail that wound higher up the ridge toward a small dome structure she could just make out against the pale afternoon sky. The observatory, when she reached it, was a modest wooden building topped with a simple domed roof, clearly built by careful, patient hands rather than professional craftsmen, a labor of devotion rather than commerce. A section of the domed roof had been fitted with a panel that could be slid open, she realized, to reveal the sky above, and a simple brass telescope stood still mounted on its tripod near the room's center, dust-filmed but otherwise remarkably preserved by the dry desert air. She moved slowly through the small space, feeling the particular hush of a place built for quiet contemplation. A simple wooden bench had been built along one curved wall, worn smooth in the middle, where a body had sat night after night, watching the sky above. A small wood stove stood cold and quiet in one corner, clearly meant to keep a winter watcher comfortable through long, cold nights of observation. And beside it, a neat stack of split firewood remained exactly as it had been left undisturbed by any hand since. On the wall, she found a scattering of hand-drawn star charts, careful and precise, marking the paths of constellations across the changing seasons, each chart labeled in Silas Whitlock's same careful hand that had filled his journals. She recognized on one chart a careful sketch of the Great Bear, wheeling slowly around the fixed point of the northern star, annotated in small, neat script. This one alone never seems to hurry anywhere at all. Perhaps a lesson worth learning. She found on a shelf beneath the telescope a modest stack of journals bound in the same worn leather as those she had found in the workshop below. She settled into an old wooden chair near the telescope, golden afternoon light slanting through the observatory's single window, and began to read. I have come to spend more of my evenings here than in my workshop. Below the first entry read, and I find I do not miss the workshop's demands nearly so much as I once thought I would. There is something in watching the stars that a man cannot rush, no matter how skilled his hands, no matter how fine his instruments. The stars move at their own pace on their own schedule, indifferent entirely to the small urgencies of human clockwork. Josephine turned the page carefully. I have begun to wonder whether the stopping of our clocks was never truly about clocks at all. Perhaps it was the desert's way of reminding us that we live already inside a far grander clockwork, the slow wheel of the seasons, the patient turning of the stars overhead, the long, unhurried rhythm of a world that does not require our small brass gears to keep its true time. Perhaps our clocks stopped simply because they had become unnecessary redundant beside the far vaster clock the desert itself keeps. I think often these nights of the difference between measuring time and marking it. A clock measures, divides the day into equal and different portions, cares nothing for what fills them. But the stars mark time differently. They notice. The same constellation that rose over my first winter here rises still changed only by my own changed eyes watching it. I have come to prefer being marked by time this way rather than merely measured by it. She read on, moving through entry after entry, finding in Silas Whitlock's final years a gentle, unhurried peace that seemed to deepen with each passing season, a man who had spent his working life insisting on precision, gradually learning to release that insistence page by careful page in favor of something softer and more spacious. Near the back of the final journal, she found an entry that seemed different from the rest. Shorter, more immediate, written, she suspected, on one of the very last nights of Silas Whitlock's long life. Tonight the sky is clearer than I have seen it in years, he had written. I sat at my telescope until well past midnight, watching the slow wheel of the stars turn overhead, and I found myself thinking, not for the first time, that perhaps time never stopped in Forgotten Springs at all. Perhaps it simply chose on that long ago afternoon to stop rushing. Perhaps it decided the way a tired traveler decides at the end of a long day's journey that it had arrived exactly where it meant to be and saw no further need to hurry onward. I do not know if this is true. I have spent a lifetime among gears and springs and mainsprings, and I confess I understand the slow wheel of the stars far less than I once understood the mechanism of a pocket watch. But I find I do not mind the not knowing nearly so much as I once did. There is a peace in simply watching rather than needing to understand. I commend that peace to whoever finds these pages after me, whenever that may be, however many years hence. Josephine set the journal down gently in her lap and looked up through the observatory's open dome panel, where the sky had begun without her, quite noticing its own long transition from afternoon gold toward the deeper blue of coming evening. She thought of the question that had brought her to Forgotten Springs. Why had every clock in this town stopped at the very same hour all those years ago, and found for the first time since her arrival that she no longer felt the question pressing at her the way it once had? Perhaps Silas Whitlock was right. Perhaps the mystery was never truly about mechanism or explanation at all, but about permission. Permission to stop rushing. Permission to let an hour be as long and as full as it wanted to be. Permission to watch a sunset or a star-filled sky without needing to hold it, capture it, or explain it away. She sat for a long while in the observatory's quiet golden then blue light, the brass telescope standing patient and still beside her, the small stack of journals resting gently in her lap, and felt something settle deep within her chest. Not an answer exactly, but something that felt in that particular moment very much like one. When she finally rose to make her way back down toward town, The sky outside had turned a deep, soft violet, the first stars beginning their slow, patient climb above the ridge, and Josephine found she was in no hurry at all to reach the bottom of the path. She walked slowly the way everyone in Forgotten Springs seemed to walk, feeling the cool evening air settle gently against her skin, and thought with a small private smile that she understood now why Silas Whitlock had spent his final years watching the stars instead of the gears. Some things she was beginning to learn were never meant to be captured at all, only witnessed. She lingered a while longer beside the old telescope before finally rising to leave, running her fingers gently along its dust-filmed brass, feeling the smooth, worn places where a careful hand had rested many hundreds of times before her own. Through the observatory's open dome panel, the first stars had begun to prick through the deepening violet overhead, faint and scattered at first, then thickening moment by moment into the vast silver-strewn canopy she had come to associate with every night of her stay in Forgotten Springs. She thought, gathering the journals gently into her arms, that there was something fitting in reading a clockmaker's final thoughts beneath an open sky, rather than a closed roof, as though Silas Whitlock himself had built this small domed room precisely so that the heavens might have the final word on all his years of careful earthly mechanism. She closed the journal she held, the leather worn soft as cloth beneath her fingers, and allowed herself one last long look through the open panel at the darkening sky before she made her way back toward the door. Outside, the evening air had cooled pleasantly, carrying the mingled scent of sage and cooling stone, and she paused on the observatory's modest step to look back once more at the small domed building silhouetted against the first full dark of night. It occurred to her, walking slowly back down the path toward town, journals held carefully against her chest, that she had come to this ridge searching for an explanation, and had found instead something far more durable, an example. A man who had spent a lifetime insisting the world bend to his precise measurements, learning at last to set down that insistence, and finding in its place a wide and patient peace. She did not know if she could learn that same lesson so completely in her own remaining years, but she suspected, walking down through the darkening sage toward the lantern-lit windows of Forgotten Springs, that she had already begun. Chapter 9. The moment when time itself seems to pause. That night, Josephine found she could not sleep, though the reluctance carried none of her old restlessness, only a quiet, wide-awake wonder that made the narrow bed at Widow Hensley's boarding house feel less like a place to lie still than a place to simply be present. She rose sometime near midnight, drawn by some soft, unnamed pull, and dressed quietly, careful not to disturb the sleeping house around her, and stepped out into the cool desert night. The town lay hushed in silver beneath an impossibly vast spread of stars, more stars than she had ever seen gathered in a single sky, scattered so thickly across the darkness that they seemed almost to blur together into pale rivers of light. The moon hung low and golden near the horizon, casting long, gentle shadows across the empty street, and the whole town seemed to hold itself in a stillness deeper than any she had felt since her arrival. She walked without any particular destination, following some quiet instinct that led her back along the familiar path toward the ridge, past the dark, silent shape of Silas Whitlock's old workshop, up toward the observatory where she had spent her afternoon among his final writings. The desert air was cool and still, carrying the faint, sweet scent of sagebrush and the mineral hush of the spring far below, and Josephine found her own footsteps falling into the same unhurried rhythm she had noticed in every soul she'd met in this town, as though the land itself had taught her body a new and gentler pace. Along the way, she passed the small graveyard where Silas Whitlock rested, its modest stones pale and silent beneath the moonlight, and she paused a moment at the low fence, feeling an odd, gentle kinship with the quiet ground within it. She thought of the carved words on his headstone, "He kept good time in his own way," and found herself wondering whether he had ever walked this very path at this very hour, drawn by the same wordless pull that had brought her out into the night. She continued on past the workshop's dark silhouette, its dozens of silent clocks sleeping undisturbed within, and climbed the last gentle rise toward the observatory, her breath soft and even in the cool night air. She reached the flat outcropping of stone near the observatory, where she had sat with Amelia some evenings before, and settled onto its still warm surface, tilting her face upward toward the vast star-scattered sky. And there, in that quiet hour past midnight, something extraordinary began so softly that at first she could not have said exactly when it started. The wind, which had been moving gently through the sagebrush and cottonwoods below, seemed to grow very still, as though it too had paused mid-breath. The stars overhead, which she had watched wheeling slowly across the sky every night of her stay, seemed for a long suspended moment to hold entirely motionless, as though someone had reached up and gently stilled the great turning mechanism of the heavens themselves. Josephine sat very still, hardly daring to breathe, feeling a hush settle over her that was unlike anything she had known before. Not fear, not confusion, but a vast spreading peace that seemed to rise up from the very stones beneath her and settle into every corner of her body. For one long, impossible moment, she felt herself standing entirely outside the ordinary flow of time. There was no sense of urgency in it, no sense of anything being wrong or strange in the way she might have expected. It felt instead like the particular stillness of a held breath at the very top of an inhale, that brief and perfect pause, before the exhale begins a moment stretched wide and patient, as though time itself had simply decided for this one suspended instant to rest. Even the small night sounds she had grown accustomed to over her days in Forgotten Springs seemed to fall away entirely. No distant dog, no settling floorboard, no far-off murmur of the spring below. There was only the vast silent sky above her and the warm stone beneath her, and her own heartbeat, which she found listening closely, had slowed to match the stillness around her, as though her own body had quietly agreed to keep the same patient time as the paused world around it. She thought in that timeless space of everything the town had shown her in her days there. Mrs. Odell's gentle acceptance of her husband's silent clock. Tom Rourke's description of hours that stretch fuller than hours had any right to stretch. Reverend Coltrane's quiet peace with a mystery he had long ago stopped needing to solve. Silas Whitlock's final patient journals, written by starlight rather than lamplight in the last unhurried years of a long and thoughtful life. She thought of her own restless years of travel, gathering stories the way a person gathers firewood against some imagined coming cold, always rushing onward before she had properly finished sitting with what she'd already found. And in that suspended timeless moment beneath the star-filled sky of Forgotten Springs, she felt for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely and completely at rest. She could not have said how long the moment lasted. It might have been a single held breath. It might have been the whole slow turning of an hour. Time in that suspended instant had ceased to offer her any of its ordinary measurements, and she found she did not mind the absence of them at all. She thought in that vast hush of every ticking clock she had ever owned or known. The brass carriage clock on her father's desk wound each morning with brisk, businesslike efficiency. The pocket watch she herself carried checked 100 times a day out of habit rather than necessity. The countless public clocks in countless town squares, all insisting always that the next hour mattered more than the one currently being lived. She wondered in that suspended moment whether she might learn to carry her own pocket watch a little differently from now on, not as a master to be obeyed, but as a quiet companion consulted gently rather than anxiously when the moment truly called for it. Slowly, gently, the world began to move again. The wind stirred softly through the sagebrush below. The stars, so still a moment before, resumed their vast, patient wheeling across the sky. Somewhere far below, she heard the faint, familiar trickle of the spring, finding its way over smooth stone, keeping its own unhurried time exactly as it always had. Josephine sat very still for a long while afterward, feeling the ordinary night settle back around her, and found that she was not disappointed the moment had passed. If anything, she felt a quiet gratitude, the way one might feel grateful for having witnessed a rare and beautiful bird alight briefly on a branch before continuing on its own unknowable journey. She thought of Silas Whitlock's words written in the quiet hush of this very observatory. Perhaps time never stopped at all, only chose to stop rushing. She thought too of her own life and of all the sunsets and quiet hours she had rushed past in her long career of gathering other people's stories, never quite pausing to let any single moment be as full as it wanted to be. She rose at last from the flat stone, her body loose and unhurried, in a way she had not felt in years, and made her way slowly back down the path toward town. The moon low and golden above the western ridge, the whole basin below her hushed and silver and utterly at peace. She did not know, walking back through the sleeping streets of Forgotten Springs, toward Widow Hensley's boarding house, whether she had witnessed a miracle or simply a trick of tired eyes and a mind grown unusually quiet. She found remarkably that she did not need to know which it had been. Some things she was learning at last to accept were meant only to be witnessed, not explained. She reached the boarding house well past the deepest part of the night and found the whole street holding the same silvered hush she had felt on the ridge, as though the entire town had shared in its own way in whatever brief stillness had settled over her beneath the stars. She climbed the stairs quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping house, and paused at her window a moment before finally lying down, looking out one last time at the moon, now hanging low and heavy above the western hills, the light it cast turning every rooftop the soft color of old silver. She thought, settling at last beneath her quilt, that she would carry the memory of that suspended, timeless moment for the rest of her days, whether or not she ever found the words to properly describe it to another living soul. Some experiences, she was beginning to understand, resisted translation the way a dream resists being told the next morning vivid and whole, in the living of it softened and partial in the telling. She closed her eyes and felt sleep come for her gently, the way it always seemed to come. In this town, not as an ending to the day, but as its own quiet continuation, the same unhurried rhythm carrying her onward from waking into rest without any seam between them at all. Outside her window, the stars continued their vast, patient wheeling exactly as they always had, and somewhere far below, the spring went on, trickling over smooth stone, keeping the only time that Forgotten Springs had ever truly needed. Chapter 10. Josephine's Peaceful Departure. Morning came softly after that long, suspended night sunlight, spilling gently across the empty streets of Forgotten Springs in pale gold ribbons, and Josephine woke in her narrow bed at Widow Hensley's boarding house, feeling more deeply rested than she had felt in all her years of restless traveling. She lay still for a long while, watching dust motes drift lazily through the morning light that fell across her quilt, and found herself thinking, without any particular urgency, that it might soon be time to continue on her journey. She thought of the small wooden clock beside her bed, its hands still resting at 3:30, exactly as they had every morning of her stay, and found that she had come without quite noticing when to regard it with something like affection rather than curiosity. It no longer seemed to her a broken thing, or even a mysterious one, so much as a quiet companion that had kept her gentle company through 5 nights of the soundest sleep she could remember. She thought she might miss its silent, patient face more than she expected to miss anything else about the room. She had come to Forgotten Springs seeking a story, and she would leave, she realized, with something far more valuable than any story she might have gathered in her notebook, though her notebook too was fuller than it had been in years, rich with the soft, circling testimonies of a town that had made its peace with a mystery it would never fully solve. She rose and dressed slowly and found Widow Hensley already at the kitchen table, coffee steaming gently in 2 waiting cups. "You'll be leaving soon," the widow said. It was not quite a question the way so much of what she said was not quite a question. "I think I will," Josephine admitted, "though I confess I find myself reluctant." "Most who come here do," Widow Hensley said, settling into her chair with the same unhurried grace Josephine had come to expect. "The town has a way of asking a body to stay longer than they planned, but it never asks anyone to stay forever unless that's what their own heart truly wants. Do you think I've found what I came looking for?" The widow considered the question with her usual patient care, wrapping both hands around her own cup of coffee. "I think," she said slowly, "you came looking for a mystery to solve, and you're leaving instead with a mystery to carry gently, the way a person carries a smooth stone in their pocket, not because they understand it, but because it feels good against their palm." Josephine smiled at that feeling, the truth of it settled warmly into her chest. "I think that's exactly right." She spent her final morning in Forgotten Springs walking the quiet streets one last time, pausing at each familiar place she had come to know so well in her short stay, the mercantile porch where Mr. Abernathy still rocked in his worn chair, offering her a slow, knowing nod as she passed. The schoolhouse where she could hear Amelia's soft voice leading the children through their morning lessons. The small church, its modest steeple casting its long, gentle shadow across the dusty street. The well where the same rhythm of drawn water continued exactly as it had every morning of her stay. She found Amelia during the midday recess, and the 2 women embraced warmly on the schoolhouse steps. "I'll miss our evening walks," Josephine said. "As will I," Amelia replied, "though I have a feeling you'll carry a piece of this ridge with you wherever your travels take you next." "I think you might be right about that." Amelia held her a moment longer, then stepped back, studying Josephine's face with the same open warmth she had offered from their very first meeting at the well. "Will you write of us?" she asked. "In your collections, I mean. Will Forgotten Springs become one of your stories?" Josephine considered the question honestly. "I think it might," she said, "though I find I want to write it carefully if I do. I don't want to hand readers a solved mystery. I think I'd rather hand them the same unhurried piece I found here, and let them sit with the not knowing the way I've learned to. That sounds exactly right, Amelia said, smiling. Silas Whitlock would have approved, I think. She found Reverend Coltrane at the church, and he pressed her hand warmly between both of his. Travel safely, Miss Clay, he said. And should you ever find yourself needing to remember how to rest, you'll know the way back to us. I hope I won't need reminding too often, Josephine said, though I suspect old habits have a way of creeping back in given enough busy years. They do, the Reverend agreed with a gentle, knowing smile. Most of us who live here still catch ourselves rushing now and again, truth be told. The gift of this place isn't that we've forgotten how to hurry entirely. It's that we've learned when we notice ourselves hurrying to simply stop and breathe and begin again slower. I'd wager you know that trick now too, wherever your road takes you next. She found Miss Prescott at the schoolhouse, and the older woman handed her unprompted a small bundle wrapped carefully in soft cloth. Silas Whitlock's journals, Miss Prescott said. The ones from the observatory. I think he'd have wanted someone who truly listened to carry them onward rather than let them gather dust on a forgotten shelf. Josephine accepted the bundle with careful, grateful hands, feeling the weight of it settle meaningfully against her chest. She stopped once more on her way back through town at the livery stable where the same young man who had taken her mare that first evening was currying another traveler's horse with slow, patient strokes. Leaving us today, he asked, looking up. This afternoon, Josephine said. Your town has given me more than I came looking for. That's usually the way of it, he said, echoing without knowing it the same words Mr. Abernathy had offered her days before. I'll have your mare ready within the hour. She's rested well these past days. You'll find her steps a little easier than when you rode in, I'd wager. He was right, she would discover later riding out along the eastern road. Her mare's gait seemed looser, more at ease, as though the animal too had absorbed some measure of the town's unhurried peace during her days of rest in its quiet stable. She lingered a moment longer at the stable's wide doorway, watching motes of hay dust turn slowly in the shaft of afternoon light before making her way back toward the boarding house to gather her things. By early afternoon, her mare was saddled and waiting outside Widow Hensley's boarding house, her travel bags packed with the same unhurried care she had learned to bring to everything during her stay in Forgotten Springs. Widow Hensley walked her out to the street, and the two women stood together for a long moment in the warm afternoon light. Thank you, Josephine said, for taking me in, for all of it. You needed rest, Widow Hensley said simply. This town has a way of giving that to those who come to it with an open heart. You came with exactly that, Miss Clay, whether you knew it at the time or not. Josephine mounted her mare slowly, unhurried, and looked back one final time at the quiet town cupped in its wide desert basin, the faded storefronts, the modest church steeple, the cottonwood trees standing sentinel near the spring, the whole peaceful scene gilded now in the same honey-gold light that had greeted her upon her arrival, as though the town wished to send her off exactly as it had welcomed her. She thought of every stop clock she had cataloged during her stay, hands frozen at 3:30, in 100 quiet rooms across the town, and found she no longer felt any pressing need to understand precisely why. She thought instead of Silas Whitlock's gentle words written by starlight in his small observatory, some things are meant only to be witnessed, not explained. She turned her mare toward the eastern road, the direction from which she'd come, though she suspected she would carry Forgotten Springs with her far longer than she carried any destination waiting ahead. As she rode slowly up the same rise from which she'd first glimpsed the town 3 evenings before, she paused once more to look back, watching the last of the afternoon light spill gently across the rooftops below, watching thin threads of chimney smoke drift upward in their own unhurried time. Somewhere below, she knew 100 clocks still stood silent in their quiet rooms, hands resting patiently at 3:30, keeping watch over a town that had long ago learned the particular grace of simply being rather than rushing. She turned her mare eastward at last and rode on unhurried into the wide and waiting afternoon. She rode for perhaps an hour before she allowed herself to stop at a low rise where a single cottonwood offered a patch of generous shade beside the trail, and there she paused, dismounting to let her mare graze a while on the sparse grass growing at the tree's roots. She took out her notebook, intending to add some final observation to close her account of Forgotten Springs, and found turning through its pages that she had filled it with far more than facts and quotations. Threaded between the careful notes were her own private reflections, jotted in odd moments over her days in town. Small unguarded thoughts about her own restless years, her own forgotten capacity for stillness, her own slow, unplanned unwinding in the presence of a town that asked nothing of her but patience. She did not add anything further to the notebook that afternoon. She found instead that she simply wanted to sit a while in the cottonwood's dappled shade, watching her mare crop contentedly at the grass, listening to the wind move through the leaves above her, with the same unhurried patience she had come to know so well over her days in the quiet basin behind her. A pair of small desert wrens flitted through the branches overhead, unbothered by her presence, pausing now and then to consider her with quick, curious tilts of their heads before returning to their own small, unhurried business among the leaves. She watched them for a long while, feeling no particular need to note their behavior in her notebook, no particular need to do anything at all, except simply watch the way Silas Whitlock must have simply watched his stars night after patient night, without ever needing his watching to add up to some larger conclusion. When she finally remounted and continued on her way, the sun had begun its own long familiar descent toward the western hills, gilding the desert around her in the same honeyed light that had first greeted her at the edge of Forgotten Springs. She rode on through that gentle evening light without any particular hurry, feeling, for the first time in her long career of travel, that she was not merely moving toward her next destination, but carrying something valuable quietly and carefully forward with her. Epilogue. They say Josephine Clay carried Silas Whitlock's journals with her for the rest of her traveling years, reading them again from time to time by lamplight in 100 different rooms across the territory, though she never again spoke of Forgotten Springs as a mystery waiting to be solved. Travelers who met her in later years said she had a particular quality about her that was hard to name, an unhurried stillness, a patience that seemed to settle any room she entered as though she had learned somewhere along her travels, a secret about time that most people never discover at all. When asked occasionally whether the old legend was true, whether there truly existed a town in the Utah Territory where every clock had stopped at the very same hour and never moved again, she would only smile, the same slow, knowing smile that Mr. Abernathy had once offered her from his porch, and say that some legends were better carried gently than explained. In the years that followed, she wrote often of other towns, other legends, other quiet mysteries gathered along the long roads of her traveling life. But she kept Silas Whitlock's journals close beside her writing desk always, and more than one visitor to her later years remarked on the particular unhurried quality of her hospitality, the way she never seemed to glance toward a clock, the way she poured tea as though the pouring itself deserved its own patient attention, the way conversations in her small study seemed to breathe more easily than conversations anywhere else they had known. When she grew old herself, she would sometimes tell young folklorists who came seeking her guidance that the finest stories were not the ones with the tidiest endings, but the ones that left a little room inside them for the listener to rest. She would tell them of a town in the Utah Territory where the clocks had once stopped altogether and let the telling trail off exactly where the mystery itself had always trailed off, unresolved, ungrasping, and somehow entirely complete. Somewhere beyond the long desert roads, past the last fences and the last rutted wagon trails, Forgotten Springs rests still in its wide, quiet basin, exactly as it has for longer than anyone alive can properly recall. Its clocks remain silent, hands frozen at 3:30 in 100 peaceful rooms. Its people still sleep more deeply than any others in the territory, and wake without hurry, and move through their days at exactly the pace the desert itself has always kept. And somewhere on a quiet ridge above the town, an old brass telescope still stands patient beside a small stack of journals, waiting for anyone willing to climb the gentle path and sit a while beneath the vast, unhurried wheel of the stars. Perhaps the mystery of Forgotten Springs was never meant to be solved. Perhaps some places exist only to remind weary travelers that life is gentler, fuller, and infinitely more restful when time is finally allowed to breathe. Perhaps, too, every listener carries their own small Forgotten Springs somewhere within them, some quiet, half-remembered hour when the rushing simply stopped, if only for a moment, and something old and patient and kind rose up to take its place. Perhaps that memory is waiting now somewhere just beneath the surface of tonight's tired thoughts, ready to surface gently, the way Josephine's own childhood memories surfaced beneath that wide, star-scattered desert sky. So tonight, wherever you are, let your own breathing slow to match the pace of that quiet desert town. Let your thoughts loosen the way old grudges loosened in Forgotten Springs. Let your memories surface softly, the way Josephine's memories surfaced beneath that endless star-scattered sky. And if you find your own thoughts drifting slow and unhurried towards sleep, know that somewhere out past the last fences of the world, 100 silent clocks are keeping watch over you too, hands resting gently at 3:30, asking nothing of you at all. Just for tonight, let time itself come and rest beside you. Close your eyes and drift. Thank you for letting time slow down with me tonight. Wherever you are, may your dreams move as gently as the silent clocks of forgotten springs.